Stream. Something Pacific held the night together. The first thought that came to Will was that it was the time, the season, but the thought didn't stay. It slipped into the night, and no other thought replaced it, so he accepted the peace. There were a few patches of white left, but most of the snow had melted. The gray clouds that had been visible during the day, and had brought the snow in the late afternoon, rested between the street and the night, invisible but conceivable because they hid the stars. The 2- and 3-story brick buildings were wet, as was the ground, and the air was cold. Every vision is the responsibility of its seer, Cobb said. I'm not asking you to interpret my vision, Will said. I'm just asking you to help me understand if it was even a vision. Cobb thought about the request for a moment, and then he said, a vision is like an erection. It's a part of you, but not really a part of you. It seems to have its own life. A hard-on? Will said. We have to wait a few minutes, Cobb said. Give them a head start. What do they look like? Will asked. Not too bad, Cobb said. Not too fucking bad. Cobb and Will stood on the sidewalk for 5 minutes and said nothing. Then they started to walk down the street. It was 1109897 Ontario Incorporated's executive Christmas party, but it was just Will and Cobb. Robert Polsky had not been seen for quite some time. He just sort of disappeared. They weren't worried, though. Polsky made his own way in the world. He answered to nobody. Cobb and Will respected him for it. He was their absent chief. It was the 23rd of December, just past the shortest day of the year, and winter by any calendar. They turned into the tavern at the Gladstone Hotel. The Gladstone Hotel was the only place Cobb would copulate since his release from Warkworth Penitentiary. It was an animal behavior. All animals understood the vulnerability inherent in intercourse. It was an altered state of mind, and all animals, like Cobb, had behavior that defined their sexuality. Cobb copulated only at the Gladstone Hotel. There were 2 men at the one pool table in the tavern, and they appeared to be the only patrons, aside from Will, Cobb, and the 2 prostitutes, who were sitting at the bar. Cobb and Will went over and sat on opposite sides of them. The bartender walked over, stopped in front of Cobb, and pointed at the drinks in front of the prostitutes. Cobb threw a $10 bill down. The bartender scooped it up and came back with the change a moment later. The prostitutes tipped their glasses until the ice rattled against their teeth. Then they got off their stools and walked into the lobby, without indicating whether Cobb and Will were to follow them. Cobb got up and motioned for Will to do the same. The bartender never looked out from behind his newspaper. On the way out to the lobby, Will saw Dorothy, the waitress from the Dolphin, in a dark corner of the tavern. She pretended not to see him. When Cobb and Will got into the lobby, they caught sight of the 2 black skirts as they disappeared around the corner to ascend the 2nd flight of stairs. Cobb and Will followed, always a flight of stairs behind the prostitutes until the 4th floor, which was the last. Cobb opened the door to the landing, which had 1 mirrored bureau with a black rotary telephone on it, and 1 tin garbage can with no lid. The landing smelled of sour milk. Shit. This place stinks worse than the bathroom at home. Cobb snickered, as though he enjoyed the smell despite his complaint. When they turned the corner and could see down the hall, the prostitutes were at the end of the hall looking back at them. Cobb turned to Will and said, "Okay, which one do you want?" Will didn't look down the hall. He looked at the floor instead. "It doesn't matter to me." He felt a movement in his stomach and winced. "All right," Cobb said. "I'll take the shorter one." Cobb nodded his head, more to himself than Will, then started down the hall. Will grabbed his elbow. "What does the tall one look like up close? Like, what does she look like up close?" "She's all right," Cobb said. "She's okay." "All right," Will said. They both walked down the hall. Will noticed that the floor wasn't level, and that most of the doors had been poorly cut to their frames. He could catch glimpses of the life inside some of the rooms, like shadows, or a television screen, or an old man in an undershirt, and he could hear voices from the rooms. "Hey, It's a Wonderful Life is on television," Will said. His face glowed with a childlike warmth. "It's a good flick," Cobb said. "I saw it this week at Patty's. He has it on tape." Each of the prostitutes had a hand on a doorknob and were facing each other with their backs against the 2 doors on opposite sides of the hall. Cobb directed himself to the shorter, younger woman. She opened her door, and the 2 of them went into the room. Cobb shut the door behind them. Will and the other prostitute were left in the hall alone. A long moment passed before Cobb reappeared. "Almost forgot," he said. He handed the older woman some rolled-up bills. She held the money clenched in her fist and went into her room. She left the door open behind her. Cobb looked at Will and said, "Every moment we're living, we're dying," and then he went back into his room. Will went into the room his woman had gone into and closed the door behind him. The tall woman appeared about 35 to Will, and the cheekbones which had made her look exotic in the bad lighting of the bar, left her frail looking under the room's one bare light bulb in the center of the 12-foot high ceiling. Will stood just inside the room, with his back to the door. He watched her clear off the bed, which had a bag of overripe bananas on it, a garbage bag full of clothes, and a few cassette tapes. He saw that her skin was blotched with pink marks, and the veins in her thin forearms were as pronounced as the grooves in a coarse bark. Her lips were hard and chapped in spots. Her nose was pointed. Her eyes were dark and sunken. Her hair was black at the roots. The room had a queen-size bed on an old steel frame, a large cabinet with a mirrored door, a clothes bureau, a television, a small, empty bookcase, a round sitting table with 2 chairs that overlooked the parking lot, and a railway bridge that went over the street Will and Cobb had just walked up. As he looked around the room, he could define a feeling of vacancy, despite all the articles crammed into it. Upon looking up, he realized it was the high ceiling which gave him the feeling. "So, what do you do?" the prostitute asked. "I manage an investment portfolio in a small corporation that wants to get into the oxygen market before it's fully defined, so that takes up a good portion of my time. And I had a vision and I'm trying to understand that." "Uh-huh," the prostitute said. "So what do you want, baby?" She stood on the other side of the bed, with her hands on her hips. Will shrugged his shoulders. "You don't know," she said. "Would you like me to suck you?" Will nodded his head. "All right, take your pants off then." Will unbuttoned his jeans and let them fall to his ankles. Then he sat down, unlaced his shoes, took them off, pulled his jeans over his feet, and threw them into a corner of the room. "Your underwear too," she said. "You can leave the socks on. It's kind of cold in here." He looked into her eyes, then bent his head down, pushed his jockey shorts to his feet, and kicked them into the corner with his jeans. "You want to take your shirt off, baby?" she asked from where she sat on the bed, with her legs curled around her, like a cat. He unbuttoned the shirt and tossed it into the corner, then stared at her from his seat at the little table by the window. She got off the bed and walked over to him slowly, removing her black blouse, ritualizing each button in a practiced and perfunctory eroticism. She had on a black bra, which she unclipped and let fall to the floor. Her breasts were small. He cupped one. It was firm. The nipple stayed soft and fleshy, as he pinched it softly between his index finger and thumb. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Candy," she said. "How do you spell it?" "C-A-N-D-Y. She got on her knees and leaned in between his legs, which she spread further apart with her hands, and she began licking his soft penis. He felt a stir between his legs, but didn't get hard. She kept licking and looking up at him every 15 seconds or so. "I don't want to take it into my mouth," she said. "Even though you're not really hard yet, you could still shoot. As soon as you get a little harder, I'll throw a safe on it." He didn't really hear her. His eyes were closed. He heard the cars passing under the railway bridge and the one short train that crossed over the bridge. Her voice melded into these noises and was as meaningless. "Are you going to help me here, baby?" she asked from between his legs. "What?" he said. "You got to help me here, baby." "How?" "Well, you're not getting hard." "Sorry." "Don't be sorry, just get hard." She bent back in and began anew to lick his still soft penis. After another minute of licking and kissing, she looked up with a frustrated and impatient face. Her lips were pursed and the callous parts were white. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "I don't know," he answered. "What if I play with myself and you see if you can get your cock hard? Play with it while you watch me. Then we'll throw a safe on it and you can put it in me, all right?" She wiggled her bony hips while pushing down on her black skirt, which fell from her knees to the ground as she sat back and slid into the center of the bed, bending it to form a deep pocket under her slight weight. She pulled aside the crotch of her black panties with her fingers, then with her right hand began to stroke the lips of her vagina, all the while staring fixedly at him and trying to hold a seductive grin that had to be loosened every few seconds to relieve the strain on the hard, dry parts of her lips. As she stroked, he noticed that the pink glitter nail polish was chipped on all her nails, every second of which was broken. "Take hold of your cock, baby," she said. Will didn't move. "What's the matter, baby?" "I don't know." A moment of confusion crossed over her face before the sexual melodrama she had created retreated back into and behind her eyes. Then she bounced off the bed with a speed that alarmed him and fumbled on the floor for her skirt, her bra, and her blouse. "You're not getting a cent back," she said. She pulled her skirt back on. "I know," Will said. "I can't give you a fucking cent, baby. For all I know, this is your trip, and then you just go home and whack yourself off. Either way, you've used me, and I can't give you a cent back. She slid her arms into her blouse and buttoned it up. I know, Will said. It's no problem. What are you going to tell your friend? She asked. And Will could tell that she was afraid of Cobb. He knew then that it was just her and her friend. Nobody was looking after them. They had to get out of whatever they got into. Nothing, Will said. It's none of his business. Some of the tension slipped out of her body when he said this. She slowed the frantic pace at which she had been dressing. She slipped her feet into her black pumps and sat down on the edge of the bed. You better stay a few minutes so you don't look stupid in front of your friend. Fuck him, Will said. She smiled. You two aren't friends? She asked. Yeah, he's my best friend right now. We live in the same rooming house. I just mean, if I stay, it's because I want to stay for a few minutes. Not because I'm worried about what my friend is going to think. You want to hear some music? She asked. Sure, yeah, Will said. She got a radio from the cabinet and handed Will the cord. Can you plug this in behind the table? She said. Will took the cord and plugged it in. They sat without speaking for several minutes and listened to pop music on the clock radio. She let one of her heels slip so that it was dangling from her toes, and she swayed her foot to the rhythm so that the bed frame began to creak, and it, too, sounded like a part of the harmony. She reached back and pulled a large deck of cards out from under one of the pillows. The room doesn't seem so empty with the music, Will said. When I first came in, it seemed so empty because the ceiling is so high, but the music seems to fill it up somehow. He watched her look through the cards. Yeah, she said, these old hotels have really high ceilings. I like them like that. She dug out a pack of cigarettes from under a pillow on the bed and said, Cigarette? Thanks, Will said, and he held out 2 fingers. She slipped a cigarette between them. He lit it with a book of matches that were on the table, then held the match out for her. Thank you, she said. They sat quietly again and listened to the music, and after a few minutes, she began to sway her foot again. Are you staying in town for Christmas? She asked. Yeah, Cobb, my buddy. He's going northeast, but I'm staying. What are you going to do? I don't know. Just bum around, I guess, see a few movies. You don't have any family here? No, none. She lit a cigarette and left the pack open for him. Have one for the road, she said. Your friend is probably finished. Thanks, Will said. What are those cards, he asked, pointing to the cards she had brought out. These? They're tarot cards. Can you do that? Read them? Sure. How? My mother taught me. How did she learn? It's not too hard. I could teach you. But being good at it is a little harder. Well, what do? They tell you things. What kind of things? Anything. A fact, a feeling, the future. They bring everything into focus. Well, how does it work? It just works. Like how? She thought for a second. And she said, it connects the stream inside you with the stream outside you. And for a while you get to stop moving and just sit in the middle of 2 flowing motions. Read mine, Will said. Now? Yes. Well, I have to charge you. What about the money my friend gave you for the sex? That's expired, honey. It's not my fault you didn't do anything with the time you had. Well, how much for a reading? It's usually $40, but I'll give it to you for $30. I guess it is Christmas, Will said. Do you believe in the cards? See, there you go. I have to believe, right? I have to believe. Not totally, but it helps. How can it be real if I have to believe it? She didn't say anything. Ah, fuck it, Will said. And he picked up his jacket, left the room, and went down to the bar to wait for Cobb. After he'd had a beer and the other cigarette candy had given him, Cobb came into the bar. They had a beer together, then Cobb handed him a Christmas card with a promissory note for half the common shares in 1109897 Ontario Inc. The note was legitimate. It was signed by Robert Polsky, though Cobb refused to say where he had found him, saying only, Robert Polsky wants to be alone. Will and Cobb were full partners. End of chapter.